November 23rd, 1944. Camp Campbell, Kentucky. The mess hall doors swung open like weary gates, releasing a wave of warmth and aroma that hit like a forgotten promise. Roasted turkey, golden, crackling skin glistening under the overhead lights. Steam rose in lazy spirals from deep metal trays heaped with mashed potatoes whipped smooth with real butter. Gravy, thick and savory, pooling in the corners. Cranberry sauce, bright red and tart, sat in bowls like jewels. Stuffing, scented with sage and onions. Pumpkin pie, cooling on racks, its surface dusted with cinnamon. Rolls still warm from the oven. Coffee brewing in giant urns, its bittersweet smell cutting through the meaty richness. For most men in the hall, it was a holiday miracle on foreign soil. Older German prisoners, veterans of North Africa, scarred by desert sand and defeat, filed in quietly, took their trays without hesitation, and sat to eat. They had known hunger in the trenches of the First War, rationing in the Weimar years, shortages under the new regime. They understood survival. They understood mercy when it wore an enemy's uniform. They ate because the body demanded it, because pride had long ago been rationed out. But at the corner table, 12 boys remained untouched. Ages 14 to 17, gray wool shirts hanging loose on gaunt frames, wrists thin as branches in winter, faces pale, eyes hollow, not from starvation alone, but from something deeper. They had been soldiers just 3 weeks earlier, Hitler Youth, captured in the hedgerows of Normandy or the frozen forests of the Ardennes during the Allied autumn push. Their uniforms stripped away, replaced with plain work clothes stamped POW. Their rifles gone. Their convictions, though, still intact, sharp, unyielding, forged in rallies since childhood. They sat with arms crossed tight across their chests, as if holding in everything they had been taught. Plates empty before them, forks untouched, eyes fixed on the scarred wooden floor, avoiding the food, avoiding the eyes of the Americans serving it, avoiding even each other. The clatter of cutlery around them slowed, then quieted. Conversations in broken English and German faded to murmurs. The room felt smaller, heavier. These were not ordinary prisoners. They had been raised in a Germany remade by slogans and songs. From age 10, they marched in torchlit parades, chanted oaths of blood and soil, learned that Germany was destined to rule because it was strong, pure, unbreakable. Surrender was betrayal. Mercy was a trick. The enemy did not feed you, he destroyed you. To accept this meal was to admit defeat, to swallow American propaganda with the gravy. They had arrived at Camp Campbell only weeks earlier, part of a long train transport from the European theater. The camp itself was enormous, over 100,000 acres of rolling Kentucky farmland, built originally to train armored divisions, now doubled as a sprawling POW enclosure. Thousands of Germans and Italians lived here under Geneva Convention rules. Housed in wooden barracks, fed 3 meals a day, paid small wages for farm or factory work. No beatings, no torture, just routine, order, and, strangest of all, kindness that felt like confusion. The boys kept apart from the older men. In the barracks they whispered in German about escape routes that existed only in fantasy, about honor that the war had already shredded. During the day they worked in silence, hauling supplies, clearing brush, moving like shadows across fields that stretched forever under gray November skies. They saw the abundance around them not as generosity, but as weakness. Americans fed their enemies because they were soft. Softness could be exploited. Softness would lose the war. Thanksgiving morning, the camp commander issued a special order. Prisoners would receive the same holiday meal as American soldiers. Turkey, stuffing, pie, a gesture of humanity, a quiet test of civility amid global carnage. The older prisoners understood. They lined up, trays in hand, and ate without question. But these 12 boys, they refused. Their leader, in a way, was Klaus, a tall, thin 17-year-old with sharp cheekbones and eyes that never quite softened. He had been in the Hitler Youth since 12, had seen friends die in the last desperate defenses of France. He translated the whispers among the group. "It's poisoned. It's a trick to make us weak. If we eat, we surrender." The others nodded, jaws set. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, real, physical hunger after weeks of travel and uncertainty. But ideology burned hotter. They would starve before they betrayed the cause. The mess hall grew quieter still. Guards watched from the edges, hands resting on belts, unsure whether to intervene. Older prisoners glanced over, some shaking their heads, others remembering their own youthful stubbornness years earlier. The food cooled on the trays, steam faded. Then Robert Dunne noticed. He was 52, a Kentucky native, with a soft drawl and hands calloused from decades in kitchens. He had served as a supply sergeant in the First World War, come home to open a diner in Clarksville, then volunteered again when the Second War came. Not to fight, but to feed. He had cooked for GIs heading overseas, for refugees streaming through Europe, for prisoners who arrived hollow-eyed and suspicious. He knew food was more than calories. It was memory, comfort, sometimes the only bridge left between people who had tried to kill each other. From the kitchen window, Dunne watched the 12 boys. He saw the defiance in their rigid postures, the fear flickering beneath it, like children trained to see every hand extended as a threat. He had seen that look in French orphans, in displaced Poles, in his own men after battles. He wiped his hands on his apron, stepped out from behind the serving line. The mess hall fell almost completely silent. Dunne walked slowly to their table. No tray, no weapon, just a man in a white cook coat, carrying only his age, his calm, and a story. He pulled up a chair at the end of the bench, sat down without asking permission, let the silence stretch long enough for hearts to pound. In careful, broken German, practiced over months of feeding men who spoke little English, Dunne asked if they understood. Klaus nodded once, stiffly. Dunne switched to slow English, voice low and steady. "I'm not here to force you," he said. "Not here to argue politics or pride. I'm here to tell you a story. After you hear it, if you still want to leave those plates empty, that's your choice. But listen first." The boys glanced at one another. Klaus translated in a murmur. They turned back to Dunne, wary but curious. Hunger and suspicion warred in their eyes. Dunne began. He spoke of a group of people who crossed an ocean, not as conquerors, not with armies, but as refugees, fleeing persecution, starving, arriving in a strange land with nothing. The first winter nearly killed them all. Half died. The survivors huddled in crude shelters, burning furniture for heat, eating their seed corn to stay alive, burying children in frozen earth. They had no strength left. Then strangers appeared, not out of duty, not for gain, simply because they saw suffering and chose to help. Those strangers taught the refugees to plant corn, to fish the rivers, to survive the brutal seasons. They shared what little they had when their own stores were low. And when the first harvest came, the refugees held a feast, not to celebrate victory over anyone, not to mark conquest, but to give thanks, to acknowledge they had been saved by people they once feared, to recognize survival as a gift, not a right. Dunne leaned slightly forward, looked at Klaus, then slowly around the table. "Thanksgiving," he said quietly, "isn't about America beating Germany. It isn't about flags or soldiers or who won what battle. It's about strangers feeding strangers. It's about being alive when you thought you wouldn't be. It's about gratitude, not because you're weak, but because you're human." He stood, said nothing more, walked back to the kitchen, apron still tied, steps measured. The mess hall remained silent. The boys sat frozen. Forks glinted untouched on the trays. Then Klaus reached out. His hand trembled just a little as he picked up his fork. He stared at the turkey, at the cranberry sauce shining like blood. He spoke softly in German. "We're not eating because we're Americans now," he said. "We're eating because we're still alive, and being alive means something." One by one, the others reached for their forks. No cheers, no speeches, just the quiet scrape of metal on porcelain. They ate slowly,
carefully, as if each bite needed permission they were only now granting themselves. The tension in the room loosened like a knot slowly untying. Guards relaxed their stances. Older prisoners returned to their meals with small knowing nods. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but irrevocably. For these boys, it was the first real crack in the armor they had worn since childhood. They had been taught the world divided into strong and weak, victors and defeated, righteous and damned. Dunne's story introduced a third path, the saved. They had thought they were defeated soldiers. Now, perhaps, they were closer to refugees. They had fled a burning country, survived battles they never chose, been fed by strangers in a land they didn't understand, just like the people in the story. Klaus finished first, set down his fork, looked at the others. One boy, 14.
The meal ended quietly that November morning. No salutes, no thanks spoken aloud. The 12 boys stood, trays cleared by habit more than gratitude, and walked back into the cold Kentucky air. But they walked differently, shoulders a fraction less rigid, steps less mechanical, as if something inside had loosened, allowing space for breath they hadn't known they were denying themselves. They were allowed to be hungry, allowed to be fed, allowed perhaps to be grateful. In the barracks that night, the whispers were different. Not escape plans or honor codes, but questions. Did you hear what he said about the strangers sharing food? They didn't have to help. They chose to. Being saved doesn't make you weak. The words felt foreign, almost dangerous, yet they lingered like the taste of turkey on the tongue, rich, unfamiliar, impossible to ignore. Over the following weeks and months, the crack widened. The boys began joining the older prisoners at work details, listening instead of isolating. They asked about pre-war Germany, not the rallies, but the ordinary days, Sunday dinners with families, harvests that weren't weapons of ideology, laughter that wasn't scripted propaganda. The veterans answered honestly, sharing memories without lectures. Slowly, the boys remembered fragments of who they had been before the machine claimed them, children who played in streets, not drilled in courtyards. Robert Dunne kept cooking, day after day. He ladled soup for the sick, baked bread for the homesick, served holiday meals without fanfare. He never mentioned the story again, never asked if it had mattered. But in the quiet way of people who understand food's deeper language, he knew. The war ground on for another 6 months. Cities burned, millions died, borders redrew in blood. But in that Kentucky mess hall, 12 boys learned something armies couldn't teach. Gratitude isn't politics. It's recognition that survival is shared, that enemies can, in a single moment, become the hands that feed rather than strike. Years passed. The boys scattered like seeds on wind. Some returned to Germany, cities reduced to rubble, families aged or gone. They rebuilt, quietly, carrying memories they rarely spoke of at first. Others immigrated, South America, the United States, seeking distance from the past. But the story traveled with them. In 1953, Klaus, now a man in his mid-20s, working perhaps in a factory or on a farm, sat down and wrote a letter, addressed to Camp Campbell, forwarded eventually to Dunne's Diner in Clarksville. In careful English, he explained he had spent years trying to forget the war, the losses, the shame. But he couldn't forget the cook, couldn't forget the story of pilgrims and strangers. He wanted Dunne to know the meal had saved more than his body. It had cracked open something sealed shut by years of hate, something that let light in. Dunne never replied. Perhaps he didn't know what to say. Perhaps words felt inadequate. But he kept the letter, tucked it inside a Bible on his kitchen shelf. It was found there after his death in 1967. Yellowed, creased, a quiet testament. The other boys carried their own versions. One told his grandson decades later over coffee in a quiet house, "We thought we were prisoners, but we were pilgrims." Pilgrims, not conquerors, not heroes in parades. People who crossed an ocean or an ocean of fire because there was no better choice. Who survived storms because turning back meant death. Who arrived in strange places carrying only hunger, fear, and fragile hope that a door might open. These boys had crossed their own ocean, not by ship, but by capture and transport, survived storms of steel and ideology instead of wind and water, been fed by strangers wearing the enemy's uniform, speaking a language barely understood. Just like the old story, just like everyone who ever learns what it truly means to say thank you when pride is useless, history roars, and gratitude becomes the only thing that still makes sense. The mess hall is gone now. Camp Campbell became Fort Campbell, larger, modern, permanent. Wooden tables torn down. Fields where guards once watched grew quiet, then busy with new soldiers, new wars, new generations who never heard the names of those 12 boys. But the story settled into memory's cracks and waited. It endures not because it altered treaties or shifted battle lines, but because it changed people, reminded us what war pauses allow, a moment to look without aiming, when guns fall silent even briefly, when orders yield to older instincts, when the question becomes not who wins, but can you accept the hand that feeds, even if it belongs to someone you were taught to hate. For those 12 boys in November 1944, the answer was yes. Not because they stopped being German or became American overnight, not because the world fixed itself or fighting ceased, but because they realized they were something older, truer, human, hungry, grateful for warm food after cold months, for a chair instead of frozen ground, for a moment without shouting or running or counting casualties. Robert Dunne taught that lesson without raising his voice. No diplomacy manuals, no carved monuments, just ladled plates, made room at the table, treated enemies like guests for one night. In doing so, he showed what peace looks like before peace officially arrives. No medals pinned to his chest, no headlines, no generals rewriting plans over that meal. It happened quietly, the way the most important things often do, unnoticed by the world, unforgettable to those sitting there. Thanksgiving that year stopped being just a holiday. It became a truth that outlasted the war, the years, the forgetting, where small gestures leave deeper marks than bullets, where a shared table achieves what armies cannot, where the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, but a meal. The greatest victory isn't conquest, but choosing to sit, pass the bread, pour the coffee, meet another's eyes long enough to see fear there too, and still offer more. That's what those boys learned in that mess hall so long ago. That's what echoes still, not because it changed borders or ended wars single-handedly, but because it changed them. And in changing them, it reminds us what we're really fighting for when battles end. Not territory, not pride, not vengeance, but the simple, quiet miracle of being alive, being fed, being grateful, being human again. When the plates were cleared that morning, the boys didn't thank Dunne aloud. They didn't salute. They simply stood and walked into the November cold. But they carried something new inside, a seed of understanding that would grow, slowly, across decades and oceans. They thought they were defeated. They learned they were survivors. And sometimes that's the beginning of everything.